In the early years of World War II, the Atlantic Ocean was the most dangerous place on Earth. Every single day, German U-boats were sinking Allied ships, merchant vessels, troop transports, even warships, faster than Britain could replace them. Entire convoys vanished beneath the waves. Families went hungry, supplies ran short. Britain faced the real possibility of starvation. Winston Churchill later admitted something no one knew at the time. The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. And he had every reason to be terrified. By 1941, Germany was winning the Battle of the Atlantic, completely. But then something unexpected happened. The tide turned, slowly at first, then dramatically. Convoys that should have been doomed suddenly slipped past Wolfpacks untouched. U-boats that once hunted with impunity found themselves ambushed or outmaneuvered, and the German Navy couldn't understand how the Allies were doing it. They assumed it must be new weapons or new technology or some brilliant admiral orchestrating an unprecedented strategy, but they were wrong, because the key breakthroughs that crippled the U-boat fleet did not come from admirals or generals or even intelligence officers. They came from a group of young women, some barely out of high school, working in secret rooms with chalkboards, graph paper, and pure mathematical genius. This is the story of the women who outsmarted the U-boats and quietly changed the course of the war. Their story begins in one of the strangest recruitment drives in British history. In 1940, women across Britain started receiving mysterious letters. Some were university students studying mathematics, some were school teachers, and many were simply bright young women recommended by a professor or headmistress who had quietly been told, "We're looking for sharp minds. Send us your best." The letters never said what the job was. They only said, "Your country needs you." Most of the women assumed they'd be typing reports or working in administration. None of them expected what came next. When they arrived at places like Bletchley Park or the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, they were met with locked doors, military secrecy, and a warning. Everything you do here is classified. You cannot tell your friends. You cannot tell your family. You may never be recognized. Then they were led into rooms filled with maps, intercepted messages, mathematical diagrams, and naval officers who were desperate for answers. And this is where the truth hit them. Britain wasn't just asking them to help with the war effort. Britain was asking them to solve the U-boat problem, a puzzle that had defeated some of the best military minds in the world. And most of these women were only 19 to 23 years old. Among them was a 19-year-old named Janet Oakell, whose calm, analytical mind would later embarrass some of the Royal Navy's most seasoned officers. The first thing the women realized was that the Battle of the Atlantic looked like pure chaos. Wolfpacks attacking from all directions, convoys changing course, ships scattered by storms, encrypted German positions arriving hours late or not at all. To most analysts, it was noise, unpredictable, unsolvable, but the women didn't see it that way. Armed with nothing but logs of ship movements, scraps of intercepted U-boat transmissions, and endless sheets of graph paper, they began doing something no one else had thought to do. They treated the Atlantic like a giant mathematical system. They charted U-boat sightings by time of day. They graphed attack angles. They measured how long it took for submarines to travel between reports. They compared convoy speeds and the spacing of escort ships. Patterns began to emerge. A U-boat stalking a convoy tended to surface at predictable intervals. Wolfpacks usually approached from specific angles depending on moonlight. Certain gaps in convoy defenses were targeted again and again. Slowly, the women realized something groundbreaking. U-boats weren't attacking randomly. They were following patterns, reliable ones. Patterns that could be modeled, predicted, exploited. And once you could predict a Wolfpack, you could avoid it, or even better, ambush it. The women have found the crack in Germany's armor, and the naval commanders didn't even know it yet. If Bletchley Park was the brain of Britain's intelligence war, then the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, WATU, was its beating heart. From the outside, it looked like any other wartime office building in Liverpool. Inside, though, behind guarded doors and blackout curtains, was one of the most extraordinary rooms of the entire war. A giant map, so large it covered the entire floor, showed the North Atlantic in painstaking detail. Shipping lanes, convoy routes, U-boat, patrol zones, every known position was marked. Young women, many barely 20 years old, stood at the edges of the map with long wooden poles, the giant brooms moving fleets of tiny model ships and submarines across the floor. This wasn't a game. This was war gaming, a technique used by naval commanders for centuries, but here it was being reinvented by women who had never set foot on a warship. They reenacted real battles, they simulated enemy tactics, they tested hundreds of hypothetical maneuvers the Navy had never tried. And something remarkable happened. The women started seeing things experienced officers couldn't see. They noticed how a convoy scattered under pressure, how U-boats circled to exploit blind spots, how a tiny change in turning angle could save dozens of ships. Naval captains would come in for briefings, convinced they were being taught by senior strategists, not realizing that the groundbreaking tactics handed to them were usually designed by young women downstairs moving model ships across a painted floor. After months of simulations, charts, and late-night analysis sessions, the women began producing tactics so bold and so counterintuitive that many naval officers initially refused to believe them. The most famous example became known as the raspberry maneuver. At night, U-boats on the surface had a huge advantage. They were faster than escort ships and could fire torpedoes with devastating accuracy. Standard naval doctrine said that if a U-boat attacked, the convoy should turn away from the threat. But the women at WATU saw something different. After replaying dozens of attacks on the giant floor map, they noticed a blind spot in the U-boat's firing arc, an angle where its torpedoes became far less effective. And the only way into that blind spot was to turn toward the attacker. It sounded insane. Sail straight at the submarine? But mathematically, it worked. The maneuver disoriented the U-boat captain, ruined his firing solution, and often forced him to crash dive in panic. The first time a real convoy used the tactic, it worked exactly as predicted. Ships that should have been lost survived the night. And that was just one breakthrough. The women also discovered predictable corridors where Wolfpacks would form, timing gaps that exposed U-boats when they surfaced to report positions, escort patterns that made convoys dramatically harder to hit. One of the most effective innovations came from the previously mentioned Janet Okal, whose beta search pattern was so consistently successful in war games that it was written directly into Allied anti-submarine tactics. Meanwhile, at Bletchley Park, hundreds of mathematicians accelerated naval enigma decrypts, sometimes finding tiny anomalies that revealed U-boat movements hours before they happened. Together, these innovations didn't just reduce losses, they changed the entire shape of the Atlantic War. There was one technique the women of WATU used that officers never forgot, even if most didn't discover it until years later. The simulations at WATU took place on a massive black linoleum floor, a giant map of the Atlantic. Officers stood on a raised platform, looking down on the exercise as if from the bridge of a ship. From that viewpoint, everything looked fair. Everything looked realistic. But the women on the floor were running a very different game. To track the U-boat's movement with perfect precision, the women used ultralight chalk marks, so faint they vanished from the officer's perspective, but remained just visible to the Wrens moving the pieces. It was a simple trick, but a brilliant one. With these nearly invisible chalk lines, the women could control the submarine's exact path, reproduce real German attack patterns, time torpedo runs precisely, and test whether the officers could anticipate a U-boat they couldn't see. The trainees genuinely believed they were hunting an unseen enemy. They didn't realize the women below had engineered that invisible enemy with chalk dust and mathematics. To many destroyer captains, the moment they learned the truth, months or even years later, was humiliating and awe-inspiring at the same time. The women they assumed were just assistants had been quietly outthinking them the entire time. And those invisible chalk submarines helped rewrite the tactics that finally turned the U-boat war around. By early 1943, something unbelievable began happening in the Atlantic. Convoys that should have been easy prey were making the crossing untouched. U-boats that had terrorized the ocean for years were suddenly the ones being hunted, and German commanders were growing frantic. The women's predictions, where U-boats would gather, when they would strike, which routes were safest, were now eerily accurate. Convoy after convoy slipped past Wolfpacks that had spent days preparing an ambush. And when a U-boat did attack, the new WATU tactics blindsided them. The raspberry maneuver disrupted firing lanes, revised escort patterns forced submarines into defensive positions, new routing schemes prevented Wolfpacks from ever concentrating their strength. To the Germans, it felt like the Allies were reading their minds. In reality, they were reading their math. Then came May 1943. In just 1 month, Germany lost 43 U-boats. The U-boat fleet never recovered. German admirals praised new technologies, improved weapons, better training, but behind the scenes, officers quietly admitted something else. Somebody is outthinking the U-boats. The Battle of the Atlantic had turned, and the turning point had been drawn on chalkboards and floor maps by minds no one had expected. When the war finally ended, Britain erupted in celebration. Convoys sailed freely, and newspapers hailed the admirals, the destroyer captains, the air crews, the convoy commanders. But the women who had helped make it possible said nothing. They had been bound by secrecy. Their work at Bletchley Park, their wargaming at WATU, their breakthroughs in pattern analysis, all of it was classified under the Official Secrets Act. Many went back to ordinary lives as teachers, scientists, nurses, mothers. Their families often never knew what they had accomplished. It wasn't until the 1970s, and in some cases the 1990s, that the documents were finally declassified. Only then did historians start to piece together the full picture. That the Battle of the Atlantic, the longest, most critical campaign of the war, had quietly been shaped by young women armed not with weapons, but with mathematics, logic, and a willingness to challenge traditional naval thinking. Their contributions didn't just save convoys, they kept Britain alive. Today their names are finally being written into history. Jean Laidlaw, Hazel Hill, Yvonne Barr, Joan Clark, and the hundreds of others whose brilliance helped turn the tide. The Battle of the Atlantic wasn't only won by ships and depth charges. It was won in quiet rooms, on chalkboards, by women the world wasn't ready to see.